Hey, good morning, everyone. Our learning is Leilish Nishmas Mindel Mariam As Kamen Reuven and Hashem Hashem Aliyah. We are on Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph on the bottom of the page. We're going to talk about C-sections, bris milah with a C-section. It's going to be a bit of an involved Gemara in terms of, we're going to learn some different halachos, but I think the most important, significant takeaway that we're going to take from this whole discussion is what do we do with a bris milah for a child born through a C-section. So Amar Rav Asi comes along and says as follows: Kol she'imo tamei leda, any newborn whose mother becomes tamei due to childbirth, Nimo Lishmona is circumcised on the 8th day. So in the beginning of Parshas Tazria, it talks about the fact that when a woman gives birth, she becomes Tamea. By definition, she becomes Tamea at that point. And the Gemara is telling us that if she becomes Tamea, if she becomes Tamei, then the child is circumcised on the 8th day. V'chol she'ein imo Tamea leda, any newborn whose mother does not become Tamei due to childbirth, ein Nimo Lishmona is not circumcised on the 8th day, but rather on the 1st day. Okay, so any situation where she is not tamei, the child is circumcised on the 1st day. Now, what is a woman who does not become tamei? Two examples are given. One is a woman who gives birth through a C-section. Okay, so if she gives birth through a C-section, only the pasuk says when she has birth, and birth has a certain definition of being born in a natural fashion, and therefore a woman who gives birth in a natural fashion is tamei. A woman who does not is not tamei, and therefore what Rav Asi is teaching us is that a woman who gives birth through a C-section, the child does not get circumcised on the 8th day, but rather on the 1st day. The other example that's given is a woman who was not Jewish when the child was born. So let's say you have a case where she gives birth to a child, and then immediately after the birth, she goes to the mikvah. Okay, she goes to the mikvah, she puts the child in the mikvah. In that case, you would not wait for the 8th day, but rather the child would be circumcised on that day. Okay, so those are two examples. Okay, fine. Those are the two examples. Shneimar, as it says, Isha kisa zriya, v'yolda zachar v'tama, etc. Uvayom hashmini yimal b'sar alaso. The pasuk that teaches about bris milah, one of the pasukim that teach about bris milah, juxtaposes the bris milah together with the pasukim that speak about tuma, and tuma only applies to a Jewish woman who gives birth in the regular way. So a non-Jewish woman, okay, just to be clear, a non-Jewish woman is not tamea. There's no concept of tuma for this type of tuma. Tumas nida, tumas leda, none of those impurities apply to a woman who is non-Jewish. So again, if a woman either gives birth through a C-section, or a woman who is non-Jewish when she gives birth to the baby, both those situations, her child would not get circumcised on the 8th day, but rather on the 1st day. Okay, now we're going to discuss this in a little more detail. Amalei Abai says like this: Doros Harishonim, and ultimately we'll see how we paskin. Right? Is this how we paskin? We do not, but we'll see. Okay, so the Gemara is going to discuss Rav Asi's statement for the rest of the time.
Why would a child be circumcised if the mother isn't Jewish?
No, if she converts right afterwards. Okay. How common is that? Okay. So the child becomes, when a parent converts with the child becomes Jewish al tanai, okay, which means that basically they become Jewish, and what happens is, we have to do this every once in a while, is that, someone will check in with the child at the age of 12 or 13, girl or boy, and we'll check in to verify that they are committed to continuing on, and usually the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. I mean, I haven't experienced, but you have all these stories of a child says no, and that's it. And they don't have to be Jewish at that point. But we would circumcise the child. The child, for all intents and purposes, is treated as a Jew. There's no practical ramification. And then, at some point, you check in. Fine. Whole discussion on how to do that. Fine. Amalei Abaye. Doros Harishon Mechichu. Abaye tries to argue with Avasi. He says the earlier generations should prove that this is not true. She'ain, meaning the earlier generations before the Torah was given. Why? She'ain imo tamei leda. The mother does not become tamei. Why does she not become tamei in the earlier generations? Because they're not Jewish. Meaning anyone from Avram and on, right? Last week's parsha, Avram, right? So Avram, the Torah says, Avram, all of your children and descendants will get circumcised on the 8th day, right? But wait a second, Avram's, children, the women are not Tmeah. It's before the Torah. There's no din tuma because they're not Jewish, right? And so the whole concept Isha Kisa Zriya, they had a mitzvah of Mila, right? Avram's descendants had a mitzvah of Mila. They all were circumcised, and yet there's no concept of tuma. And yet, what happens? She'ein imo tamei leda. She's not tamei because the whole concept of tuma does not exist. V'nima l'shmona, and nonetheless would be circumcised on the 8th day. This goes directly in the face of what Rav Asi just said. Rav Asi said, no, the two go together. Only 8th day, only tuma, only when a woman is tamei, that's when the child is circumcised on the 8th day. But if not. So what do you talk? How do you reconcile the fact that earlier generations, even though she is not tamei, she is circumcised on the 8th day? Amrlei, so Rav Asi responds, Nitna Torah. Once the Torah was given, v'nischad shalacha, a new law went went into effect. And basically, yes, it's true, before the Torah, that was not the case. But once the Torah was given, and it said, Isha Kisasriya, etc., and it speaks about the Tumah, that's when the new halacha applies. So don't ask me questions from previous to the Torah, which touches upon a very interesting discussion, which we're not going to get into right now, about what the relationship is of mitzvos before the Torah to after the Torah was given. In other words, do we see, right, everyone had 7 mitzvos, Shiva mitzvos b'nei Noach before the Torah was given. Is it that then they went ahead and 606 mitzvos were added, or is it all the older mitzvos were undone? Right, so there are certain things actually where in the mitzvah, the Shiva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are actually in some ways more stringent than they are to Torah, to the Torah mitzvahs, and therefore there's some discussion among the poskim. Do we say that those halachos apply to us plus 606, or we just ignore them entirely and we start everything fresh, and now you just have 613? This is one of the places where this concept is touched upon. We don't have the time to get into it, but there's just one of the sources in that discussion. Okay, ask the Gemara another question on Rav Asi's approach, and there's going to be a little bit more involved brisa or teachings that will be a challenge to Rav Asi's approach. Let's see. Aini, is Rav Asi's ruling true? Va'itmar, it was taught. Yotze dofen mishiyesh lo shtei arlos, a child who was born C-section or who had 2 foreskins, in other words, two male organs. Okay, so those 2 cases, C-section and 2 more male organs. Rav Huna, Rav Chia Barav, there's a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Chia Barav. They're 2 Amoraim. Chad Amar mechalim alavis haShabbos, v'chad Amar e mechalin. One says we will give a bris milah to these children, either the one born through a C-section or the one who has 2 milas on Shabbos, and one says we don't do it on Shabbos. Okay, but what do you see? They're only arguing about whether or not you do it on Shabbos. Ad kan lo pli el chalavas on Shabbos. The only argument is, will you do this on Shabbos or not? Aval l'shmona v'adem ma'alina. But everyone agrees that we do circumcise on the 8th day, right? They're not arguing, do you do it on the 8th day or not, right? Everyone would agree to do it on the 8th day. The only question is, do you do it on Shabbos or not? But they don't disagree about the 8th day. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a question, because hava hatalya, the debate about whether or not you do it on the 8th day, the debate about whether or not you do it on Shabbos is actually connected to the question of whether or not it's done on Shabbos. In other words, yes, it's true. The only thing they seem to be arguing about is Shabbos, but he says the truth is what they're really but the argument about Shabbos is actually the same argument about 8th day or not. So although they only explicitly talk about do you circumcise on Shabbos, but really the one who says you do circumcise on Shabbos holds that there is an absolute mitzvah on the 8th day, and the one who says you don't circumcise on Shabbos he holds that there is no mitzvah on the 8th day, and you really could just do it on the 1st day, but it's really the same machlokas. Fine. Now the Gemara says fine. We have no questions on Rav Asi, but now we're going to prove that Rav Asi's point is actually a machlokas tanaim. Okay, so now we're going to go back to brisas. Kitanai, it was taught in a brisa, the following. So there are 2 types, let's just talk about, so Jewish slaves, not Jewish slaves, excuse me, a slave owned by a Jew, so a non-Jew owned by, right, slavery was something that Torah does not promote, but it does not, it does not promote, but it does not negate either. And the Torah has many laws that pertain to slaves. Slavery was rather common in the ancient world, and so there is a halacha that a slave is a quasi-Jew. Okay, they have to go through tevila. Male and female would go through tevila. They would get immersed, and the males would get circumcised. If and when the slave would go free, they'd actually become Jewish. Okay, so they have this like quasi-Jewish state. They actually have mitzvos. They're obligated in some mitzvos, and there are 2 types of non-Jewish slaves. One is a slave who is bought to you, miknas kesef, that you purchase it with money, or there's something called yilid bayis, they are born to you, right? So one is that you buy them, and one is they are born to you, meaning you already have slaves and these slaves have children. Those are the 2 categories of slaves, okay? With that in mind, let's see. Kitanai, it was taught in the Brisa. Yesh yilid bayis shenimu la'echad. There is a slave born in the house, meaning born to your other slaves, who is circumcised on day 1. V'yesh yilid bayis shenimu l'shmona. And there is a slave born in the house who is circumcised on the 8th day. Okay? Yesh miknas kesef shnimu la'echad. We'll see what the examples are soon. There is a slave purchased with money who is circumcised, shnimu la'echad, who is circumcised on day 1. V'yesh miknas kesef shnimu l'shmona. And there is a slave who is purchased with money who is circumcised on day 8. Yesh miknas kesef shnimu la'echad. V'yesh miknas kesef shnimu l'shmona. Ketzad. What's the example? Now we get into the details. What is the example of a slave purchased with money that one is circumcised on day 1 and one is circumcised on day 8? So what's the example? Lakach shivcha muberes va'achar kach yolda. Okay, so if a person buys a pregnant slave woman and then she gives birth to a boy, zeu miknas kesef hanim l'shmona. This is a slave who is circumcised on day 8, right? Because when the child is born, even though the child was conceived when they were not owned by a Jew, but the child is born to a Jew, and therefore that slave is circumcised on day 8. Lakach shifcha uvlada ima. If a person bought a slave woman and the child was already born, right? So basically, a person buys a slave woman and her child. Zoe miknas kesef shnima le'echad. That's a case where the child is circumcised on day 1 of ownership. Right? In other words, when a person goes ahead and buys a slave woman and the child that her child, then the day that he buys the child, then he will circumcise the child on that day. Right? That's day 8. So that's, now we have an example of someone who is born to someone who is purchased, who is one example where the child is circumcised on day 8 because the child is born to, at that point, a slave who is owned by a Jew, and therefore the child is circumcised on day 8. And then you have one where the child is bought after the child was already born, then you would circumcise on day 1 on that day. Okay? What's the example? What's the example of a child who is born to the house, meaning born within the house, who is circumcised on day 8? That's lakach shivcha. That's a case where a person bought a slave woman, v'nis abra etzlo v'yalda, and she became pregnant while in his possession and then gave birth. Zeu yilibayis. That is someone who's born to his household, shenim l'shmona, who is circumcised on day 8. Okay, Rav Acha says, yalda v'achgach itzbila. Let's say this woman gave birth, and then the master immersed her afterwards. Now, typically, when the person has a slave woman, she is immersed right away. But let's say a person buys the slave, okay, the slave is owned by her, and then he immerses her afterwards. Right? So in that case, then the child who is born to this woman is circumcised on the first day. In other words, if in the situation where she gave birth already, when she gave birth, let's say a person owns a slave woman, but she never went to the mikvah. In that case, she does not have the laws of tumah, because what creates the laws of tumah is only once she went to the mikvah, and that gives her a quasi-Jewish status. At that point, she now assumes the properties, the identity of a quasi-Jew at that point, right? So in such a case, if she already went to the mikvah and then she had the child, then the child is going to be circumcised on day 8. If she did not go to the mikvah, even though she was already a Jewish slave woman, she was a slave woman owned by a Jew, but she did go to the mikvah, she doesn't have that quasi-Jewish state, and therefore the child born to that woman, even though she's owned by a Jew, does not have tumah, and therefore the child born is circumcised on day 1. Yes?
When using the word quasi, to what extent is this woman?
She is obligated in mitzvos.
So then she's obligated. So she's a Jew.
Nope. She is owned by. So she is. So let me say. So in this case, she is going to be. So no, but I take that back. If she did not go to the mikvah, she is not obligated in mitzvos, but she is still considered a yilid bayis. She's still considered the person's slave at that point. Right. Until she goes to the mikvah, she's not obligated in mitzvos. I take that back. But she is so you're right. She's not a quasi Jew. Maybe I should not use that term. But she is owned by a Jew, and therefore she is a yilid bayis. But she is not. Thank you. Yeah. So again, Rav Chama Amar Yalda v'achrach itbila. Let's say she is owned by a Jew, but he does not bring her to the mikvah until after the child is born. So then this child is circumcised on the first day. However, if he immersed her and then she gave birth, she is given. Then the child is circumcised on day 8. So what's the purpose? What's the rationale behind this distinction? This is what Rav Asi was teaching. Rav Asi was teaching that a child whose mother is not tameya, does not become impure, the child does not get circumcised on day 8, but rather on day 1, right? So this opinion of Rav Chama over here is which is clearly arguing on the Tanakama of this brisa, right? Is basically saying that if there's no tumah, if there's no impurity, then the child is going to be circumcised on day 1. Got that? Right? And that's the case over here of this woman who is a Jewish slave woman, but was never immersed in a mikvah. If she was never immersed in a mikvah, then she never assumes that quasi-Jewish status, and therefore the child is given a bris milah on day 1. Similarly, a woman who, let's say, has a C-section is going to only get a bris milah on day 1, according to Rav Asi. But this is only the opinion of Rav Chama, and the Tanakama is not going to agree with that. The Tanakama is going to say, no, across the board, the child gets the bris milah on day 8. Yeah? The Tanakama, the Gemara continues with Tanakama, and according to the Tanakama, lo shani lein, he doesn't not make he distinguish bein itbila v'achrach yalda, bein yalda v'achrach itbila, whether this slave woman was immersed before or after. The Tana Kama, who Rav Chama is disagreeing with, holds that whether or not she becomes impure, the child all the time is going to be circumcised on day 8. Right? So this is the view that would be arguing with Ravasi. It would be saying a woman who has, let's say, a C-section, who is not becoming Tameya, that child is going to be circumcised on day 8. Okay. Bishlam Rav Chama. So now the Gemara now just analyzes. So we found a machlokas Tanaim about Ravasi's point, about whether or not a child born with a C-section is circumcised on day 8 or not. Okay, right? But now the Gemara is just going to go a little bit deeper into the brayso that we just quoted. Bishlama l'Rav Chama mishkachas la'yidbayis nima le'echad. Now, the brayso began by seemingly saying that everyone agrees that there is a circumstance where the child will be circumcised on day 1, both according to the Tana Kama and according to Rav Chama. Okay, so again, I just want to pause. We already found that it's machlokas tanaim. Based on this last statement, we found it's machlokas tanaim. It's debate amongst tanaim whether or not a child whose mother becomes tamei is circumcised on day 1 or day 8. Rav Chama says day 1. Tanakama says on day 8. And that would be relevant to our discussion about a C-section, where the Tanakama would hold, where Rav Chama would say C-section child is given a bris milah on day 1, and the Tanakama holds that the circumcision is given on day 8. Okay, we're going to move on from that machlokes. Now we're going trying to understand. According to the Tanakama, it seemed from the brayso that everyone would agree that there are circumstances where you would get a bris milah on day 1. What is that circumstance? That's what we're going to now be looking for. Okay, so now we've moved on a little bit from our previous discussion. Okay, so Bishlam Rav Chama mishkachas la'yidbayis nima le'echad. We can understand. We know we found a case which a child born in the house is circumcised on day 1, and someone who's born in the house is circumcised on day 8. And we found a case where it was purchased with money, who's circumcised on day 1, right? And a case where a slave is purchased with money, who's circumcised on day 8. Okay, what are the cases? If, let's say, the slave woman conceived and she gave birth, and then she was later immersed in a mikvah, that's a case where the child born to her is circumcised on day 1, because the woman only immersed after she gave birth. If she was immersed first and then she gave birth later, then this is a case where, right, if she already immersed and then she gave birth, then the child born to her is circumcised on day 8. Miknas kesef nima l'shmona, and the case of a woman who's purchased with money, who's circumcised on the day 8, is it's where the master purchases a pregnant woman and he immerses her, and then she gives birth. That's a case where the child who's born to that woman is circumcised on day 8. Miknas kesef nima l'echad, what's the case where he purchases her and the child is circumcised on day 1? It's a case where a pregnant woman was purchased by 2 people. One purchased her, and one purchased the fetus. In that case, what we're going to say is that the child is going to be circumcised on day 1. Why? Because Rashi explains that there's this idea that the only time you get circumcised on day 8 is where there is a relationship between the father, in this case it's the owner, to the woman and the child. But if there's no relationship, if there's no triangle of any sorts, then the child is circumcised, is given a bris milah on day 1. Okay? So over here, where one purchases the woman and one purchases the fetus, right? In that case, you don't have that regular relationship. Again, even though it's not the regular relationship, but that relationship doesn't exist, and therefore, Rav Chama is going to say that in that case, the child who is purchased is going to be given a bris milah on day 1. Okay, Ela Tanakama. But however, according to the Tanakama, what's the case? Bishlama kulu mishkachas lahu. We found all the cases. Ela yilid bayis nimel echad hechim mishkachas la. What's the case where the slave is born in the house, yilid bayis, who is circumcised on day 1? Meaning, according to Rav Chama, he held that this distinction of tumah and not tumah doesn't exist. So where would you find a case where the child is born into the home and the child is going to be circumcised, meaning born already as a slave owned by a Jew, who the child is going to be circumcised on day 1? What's the case? So Amrav Yirmiyah blokech shivcha lu'ubara, a case where the master buys the slave woman for the right to her fetus. Okay, which is again the case where a person only owns the fetus, not the mother. Okay, so he owns the fetus, not the mother, and therefore it's not going to be that triangular case, and therefore we're going to say the child is going to be circumcised on day 1. Says the Gemara, but that doesn't work for everyone. Okay, so there's machlokes elsewhere about the following. Let's say a person owns, let's say there's a tree out in this field over here, and I go ahead and I you own a tree, and I say, Jesse, I want to own your fruit, not the tree. Okay, so am I considered the owner of the fruit exclusively, or do we say I'm the owner of the tree in as much as they give me the fruits? This has ramifications for certain halachos, okay, and it's going to have relevance over here too. When I own the fruit over here, the fetus, am I the owner of the fetus exclusively, and I have no relationship to the tree? Okay, or do I own the fruit do I own the tree in as much as they give forth the fruit? So the Gemara says, this is good according to the one who holds that ownership of the rights of the produce is not in any way related to the property at all. I just own the fruits. But according to the opinion who says that when I own the fruit, I actually am also in some way owner of the tree, then here too, there is that triangle because I'm owner of the person who owns the slave is the owner of the slave woman in as much as it gives forth the fruits. So, right. So we'll give a new case. We're talking about a case where a person buys a slave woman with the stipulation that he will not immerse her, which he should not do, because really it's important to immerse her so she has this quasi-Jewish status, which, is I would just say parenthetically, gives presumably, the whole longer discussion, which we're not getting into right now because we don't have the time, but discussion about why it is that Judaism, the Torah does not outlaw slavery. It would seem to go in the face of everything we believe about the independence of individuals, etc., etc. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a fascinating theory, which is that the way, if you look at all the laws of the Torah across the board about slavery, he suggests it's quite clear that it's setting up for a trajectory where eventually there'll be emancipation of slavery. He argues that it was too hard. It was such an integral part of society. It'd be too hard to just eradicate on the spot, and therefore he says, if you look at all the laws, and again, we don't have the time to unpack them now, but you'll see the laws, just as one example, just very, very briefly, I think we've spoken about this in the past, many of the laws that you find in the ancient world that demonstrated the mastery of a master over their slave, those things, when they're done, actually cause the slave to go free. So, for example, a slave, just as one example, when a person owned slaves, it was rather typical for them to go ahead and blind their slave as a way of, they would do this for a whole host of reasons. One of the reasons was they wanted to have slaves around who would not be aware of what was going on, but still be able to do certain work. What's a good example? Where do you see this in the Torah? An example where they would do this? Shimshon, right? Shimshon was a slave, right? All the midrashic explanations why they blinded him. But the simple explanation is, this is what was done. This was a standard thing that was done to a slave, that they would blind them as a way of giving of mastery. They would go ahead and castrate them in order to allow them to work with women to ensure that they were not impregnating the women, right? There were certain things, all those things that they would do that would show any mastery over the body. In Jewish law, that slave, what happens to that slave? That slave becomes Jewish at that moment. In other words, if you do one of those things, the slave goes free. The slave goes completely free. So he suggests that the Torah basically is putting us on the trajectory to ultimately ensure freedom of slaves. It's a theory that needs a lot more discussion. But the bottom line is, why did I get on this tangent? Because we're talking about it, but I had something else to say. I don't remember now. Okay. So the case is, that's why. Because Rav Shashia says we're talking about a case where the person buys the woman and does something wrong. Really, you're supposed to be tovel her. Why? Because once you're tovel her, then she already has a quasi-Jewish status. You're going to treat her a little bit differently, right? You're not going to treat her as like a foreigner. She already has a quasi-Jewish status, but this person buys her with intent not to immerse her, and therefore in that case, when she gives birth to a child, then we're not going to circumcise that child on day 8, but rather on day 1. Okay, bottom line is, let's I know there's a little bit of an involved Gemara. The bottom line is, this is machlokas, according to Rav Asi, a child born by C-section would get circumcised on day 1. We do not paskin that way. We paskin that the child is circumcised on day 8, even with the C-section. But what we do see in that earlier machlokas to Amoraim is that, according to the view not like Rav Asi, what comes out is that although we do circumcise on day 8, the bris milah is not mechal Shabbos. Everyone would agree, and we also rule that the circumcision of a C-section would not override Shabbos, and we would push the C-section off, we would push the bris milah off and do it on Sunday. Have a great day.